They did this to you! They're trying to turn us against each other! Just look at them. What do they know about friendship anyway? I'll get them. You watch. I'll take care of those sons of bitches.
Watch it, Alan. I'm shooting.
Oh, good Lord. It's unbelievable. It's horrible. I can't understand the reason for such cruelty. It must have something to do with some obscure sexual rite or with the almost profound respect these...
Getting very careless. Blood in your hair. What will we do? You want to look pretty, don't you? Pretty for me.
I can't believe you're not afraid.
All you have to do is piss on it.
Pretty cat blood, ain't you?
God damn it, Ralph, get out of here. Go on, get. Leave people alone.
You'll never come back again.
Oh, shut up, Ralph.
It's got a death curse. Evil.
God, my leg! God, my leg!
I'm here. You're here. There's a fog bank out there.
Messenger of God. You're doomed if you stay here.
Demanding everything, including blood.
John, I want this material burned. All of it.
I ain't the crazy one. Remember?
In the lake, the one who attacked me, the one who pulled me underneath the water. And he's still there.
Used servitude.
I think you will all meet again. In hell.
I'd have mercy on his soul. He was one ruthless son of a bitch.
Wendy, stay away! Darling, light of my life. I'm not gonna hurt you. You didn't let me finish my sentence. I said, I'm not gonna hurt you. I'm just gonna bash your brains. I'm gonna bash them right the fuck in.
Well, Dad, are you proud of me now? Do I measure up? Huh?
My son was a son of a bitch, and he was no good. That's it. My son is dead. I don't want to talk about him no more.
Oh, Cindy, you're gonna die.
Mater lacrimarum.
Ma'am,
Mater tenebrarum.
we didn't find any boy.
Mater suspiriorum.
You know as well as I do, it takes all kinds of critters to make farmer Vincent fritters.
I wonder who the real cannibals are.
I'm Mr. Parka, and we're here to cover some 1980 horror flicks that I've already covered on the show. And so I already covered City of the Living Dead, so I wanted to bring a special guest on and to talk about one of my personal favorite Fulci movies, and I'm sure it's one of his too. It's Troy Howarth.
Yes, hello. I'm here with my cat Wookie doing my best Blofeld impression, and I've written numerous books on European cult cinema in particular, although I've written about other things too, but in this context, most notably Splintered Visions, about Lucio Fulci and his films. And in addition to, there it is right there. Thank you for the plug. Numerous commentaries. And that includes the audio commentary that I did with Nathaniel Thompson for the Scorpion edition of City of the Living Dead, or Gates of Hell, whichever title you prefer, that came out back in, I don't remember what year it was now, 2020, I think.
A couple of years ago, I picked one up and I actually rewatched it for this and everything like that. Let's re-listen to the commentary and read the chapter on City of the Living Dead. So I know a lot of these answers that I'm going to ask you already about the movie and everything. But I know some of the audience probably doesn't know these. So I guess we can just get your general thoughts about the movie right off the bat.
Well, Fulci was a very diverse director. I think that's the reason I have a slight preference for him over Argento. As much as I love Argento, and I'm not one of these people that thinks that it has to be like a battle between these people. I don't. I don't tend to look at it that way. It's possible to love them both, which I do. But Argento's tended to sort of stick to a very particular type of film, whereas Fulci was more of a kind of a typical Italian craftsman in the sense that he went from genre to genre, tried all kinds of different types of films, and crucially did very well within almost all of them. I mean, really, he made some excellent Westerns, some very good comedies, horror films, even dabbled in erotica, you name it, he tried it. In terms of his horror films, which really got going in 1979 with Zombie and pretty much then dominated the bulk of the rest of his career, I'd say City of the Living Dead is the best of his horror films. It's the one I like the best anyway.
Yeah, I mean, as far as horror films are concerned, as Fulci's horror films are concerned, I do count some of when you do a lot of these lists, we always lump in giallos just because it makes it easier. So as far as his movies, it's my fourth favorite, but that's out of all the movies he's made. So I mean, I love The Beyond, Zombie, Don't Torture a Duckling, and City of the Living Dead. Those are my four favorites. I don't know, they're cream of the crop, I would say, probably.
I suppose if I did a top 5 of all of his films, it would probably be Duckling, Beatrice Cenci, New York Ripper, For the Apocalypse, and probably City of the Living Dead.
Nice. And you know what? I haven't seen what was the one you said? Is it a Conspiracy of Torture, right?
Yes, which is available on Blu-ray from 88 Films.
I do have the Blu-ray, yet I've not watched it. It's a handful of his movies I haven't seen. So, sometimes you like to save them, save some of your favorite directors' movies and everything like that. He's got enough of them, so.
Well, yeah, he made quite a few films. He was very prolific, and there really are only a couple of films of his. I mean, if I were to be honest, I think there's only like 2 of his films that I really don't like. That would be Demonia and Ghosts of Sodom. I don't include Zombie 3 in that because it's not really entirely his film. It's kind of a mongrel. If you're aware of the production of that film and how it came together and everything, a lot of it is the work of Claudio Fragasso and Bruno Mattei. So it has a certain lovable charm for what it is, but I don't really consider that to be a proper Fulci film.
It fits more in with stuff like Zombie 4 and Burial Ground and Nightmare City, just the kind of whacked out, infected zombie movies from Italy. Hell of the Living Dead, of course, too. So it fits in with more like that. I mean, Zombie is the cream of the crop when it comes to Italian zombie films. It's so much better than the other ones in terms of filmmaking.
The only one I'd put ahead of it, it's a Spanish-Italian film, but it is at least half Italian, would be Living Dead at Manchester Morgue.
Yeah, that's a classic.
Jordi Grau film, which I'm a huge fan of that one. That one I would put a little ahead of it as the best of the kind of Euro zombie movies. But yeah, Zombie's an excellent film. I mean, especially when you consider that Fulci wasn't even intended originally to direct that. It wasn't a film that he wrote. It wasn't a film that he helped to develop. He just kind of came in when they were looking for a director after Enzo Castellari had been offered it. He turned it down. He said he didn't really think it would be his kind of subject matter. But he said, who I think would be good to do this would be Lucio Fulci. So he owed Castellari a big debt of gratitude because Fulci at that point had been directing films for about 20 years. Actually, exactly 20 years at that point. He'd been in the industry longer than that as an assistant, a sometimes bit part actor, and as a writer. But he hadn't really found his niche as a director, although he really did outstanding work in the giallo. I mean, I think he was, honestly, in terms of consistency, I think he was maybe the best of the giallo filmmakers, even more so than Argento, because unlike Argento, whose later gialli are kind of all over the map, some of them are good, some of them not so good. Fulci's gialli, which stretch from 1969 with One on Top of the Other or Perversion Story, all the way through to 84 with Murder Rock, they range from good to great films. So he had a really good track record with those, but he didn't really make his name in that. He was always sort of seen as a imitative kind of a director. And even with the zombie films, same thing there. They kept insisting, he's just ripping off Romero, which is a very knee-jerk thing to say. And if you compare what he's doing in his films versus what Romero was doing in his films, they're completely, you don't want to say night and day in this context. It's a bad pun, but They're very, very, very different from each other. So I don't think that's fair at all.
I would blame only Zombie for slight ripoff, and that's from the writing, and that's the wrapping the dead up in the white sheets, which Romero had in the one scene, and the Italian people took that to like the next step and made, instead of just one scene, this is half the fucking movie is the wrapped up sheets and stuff, which I like. I mean, it's not that big of a ripoff, I don't think.
It's a cash in. It's a cash in a way that was very often the case with Italian films. There was always this trend, some film would come along, be very successful, sort of like a Dirty Harry would come along, and all of a sudden you'd have all these renegade rogue cop movies, Plitzieski films. Usually it was an American model of some type or other, that was particularly popular. The Exorcist led to a whole slew of Italian exorcism movies, and so forth. So it's a cash in, and it could have been steered more in that direction by a director who really didn't have any kind of real integrity. But I think Fulci was determined that he didn't want to make a film that was just going to be a knockoff of Romero. So he was very determined to make Zombie as different as he could. In fact, his inspiration was taken much more from the sort of moody voodoo-based zombie stories of the 1930s and 40s, things like I Walk with a Zombie, White Zombie, which was probably the first real zombie film from 1932.
Yep.
So that was different. There is allusions to voodoo in Dawn of the Dead, of course. Ken Foree refers to, I think it was his grandmother, had something to do with Granddad, Macumba. He talks about that a little bit. But Fulci goes a lot further with that. Again, of course, bearing in mind, again, he didn't write the film. Yeah. So it's Sacchetti and Sacchetti's wife, Elisa Briganti, who wrote that script, and he filmed it. And he filmed it very well.
But it's also really kind of neat that although he didn't write it, he most certainly embraced that superstitious stuff, because his movies always had the superstitious people in them, and it just almost fit in, and like he ran with that even further. So like, as someone who they always said Fulci wasn't a big lover or obsessed with horror films, like I feel like he mixed Poe, Lovecraft, and like Catholicism, superstition in City of the Living Dead and his other movies too, but so much so in City of the Living Dead, like because the coffin and stuff, it reminds me of Poe being trapped, and then of course Lovecrafty and the unknown god. So which one do you think shines, and how well do you think they blend in that movie, City of the Living Dead?
Which one of the Poe or
Lovecraft or Catholicism?
It's one of the best attempts. In a funny way, it's one of the most successful kind of evocations of Lovecraft that we've seen. It's one of those movies like Prince of Darkness, the John Carpenter film, that does a magnificent job of capturing that kind of an atmosphere and that kind of mood, even though it's completely removed. It's not based on Lovecraft. Actually, Prince of Darkness even is based around sort of Catholicism, which is completely, that's not what Lovecraft was interested in at all. But they get that mood right, and they get that atmosphere, and I think that's exactly what comes through very strong in City of the Living Dead. I mean, it's true that Fulci wasn't really a horror film nut, but he was very well read. He was an extremely cultured man, and he was well aware of other people within the genre. He always referred very favorably to Mario Bava, for example. He always called him the great Mario Bava. He didn't have such nice things to say about Argento for years, because there was a kind of a clash there. But I mean, it was understandable that he felt the way that he did. He was aware of these films. He was aware of the Romero films, of course, and all these other things I'm alluding to from the 30s and 40s, the Val Lewton films, things like that. So I think he was drawing from a big well of influences. I mean, the Catholic component of City of the Living Dead, yes, of course, it's there because, again, it's a Catholic country, and Fulci himself was he was a Catholic who described himself as a man who believed but with great doubt. He said that he wished he could feel the same as Buñuel, who was, famously said, I'm an atheist, thank God. So he wished that he could be kind of along those lines. He had a very complicated relationship with religion, which comes through in his films. In City of the Living Dead, the whole thing is triggered by the suicide of a priest. So it's a kind of a rogue priest, so to speak, that gets everything off and running in this particular story. And in earlier films like Don't Torture a Duckling and Beatrice Cenci as well, there's a heavy kind of dialogue going on with regards to the church and aspects of the church that he wasn't totally in sympathy with. So it was always kind of an ambivalent attitude that came through Poe is definitely there too, in the sense, as you say, with the premature burial aspect. Not forgetting, right after this, he made his adaptation of the Black Cat, Edgar Allan Poe, Black Cat with Patrick McGee, which is a very, I think, underrated film. It doesn't get talked about as much, I guess, because it's not all that gory. Unfortunately, that was the thing that happened with Fulci. Is he became known. Some people called him Godfather of Gore, but everybody knows that's Herschel Gordon Lewis. I mean,
we know that.
They did that because, yeah, they did that because Godfather Italian, so they figured.
Of course. Well, he's also better by a long shot.
Significantly better. Yes. Although Lewis was certainly a groundbreaker, and he's important in his way. He was never, I don't think, a great filmmaker. Fulci was, but they also call him sort of, the maestro of splatter and things like that. And he became so known for that it kind of overshadowed some of his other abilities and so forth. And they tended to think of him as just a guy that knew how to throw gore at the screen. But what I always liked about him, though, was his willingness to just go for broke. He would go places where other people would not go. The famous scene in Zombie, the eye scene that everybody remembers, it's a great example of that, because the way it's set up and the way that it's shot, you think it's going to be the typical thing where it's coming and you're going to get the build up and then it's going to cut away, and it does cut away, but then he goes back into a big close up and you get what you get. And it's an extraordinary sequence because it's so just beyond what anybody had been willing to do in the context of a mainstream film before. And then, of course, he would outdo it later on with things like The New York Ripper, where he went too far for some people. Mm-hmm. Many people felt that was the case, I guess, because the violence was taken out of the fantastic context and put into the real world. It always played to me as if it was like him saying, okay, you guys are getting off on all this blood and gore. What do you think of this? This is more the reality, and that's a very unpleasant kind of a thing. It's kind of rubbing your nose in it for 90 minutes. But I love the film personally, but I get it. I understand it's an unpleasant film, but it's deliberately unpleasant.
For sure. The thing about superstition is, like, I'm not a very religious person, but I guess I am superstitious in the stupidest kinds of ways. I don't ever do things like, oh, I'm not doing that. That just seems like bad karma, whatever. You know what I mean? I'm not playing with a Ouija board for no apparent reason. There's nothing for me to gain. I don't know if I'm going on about this, but I'm just saying, it seems like in a lot of the Euro cult movies, or even, some of the Mexican horror like A la Carta, when they judge religion in their movies, it seems so genuine because, like you said, that Fulci was inside of it. He was part of it, judging from within. And it really shows in his movies. Well, I hate to say this, but a lot of American people do it, and they're so cynical about it. And I know Fulci was cynical, but it seems so disingenuous. It seems like a bunch of people that aren't religious, so they don't know how it works. And even though I'm not religious, I feel like it seems genuine in the Euro horror films, while it seems like complete bullshit, low-hanging fruit in American cinema. Not all of them, but quite a bit. Alice Sweet Alice is a good one that I think is legitimate, but there's some that are not, especially more modern day.
Alfred Soule, who made Alice Sweet Alice, of course, he came from a Catholic background, although he turned his back on it after some unpleasantness that occurred with him and the way that the church reacted to a film that he was involved in making, a porn film, matter of fact, called Deep Sleep. So he was kind of, I guess you call him a lapsed Catholic. I mean, I was raised a Catholic myself, and for years I kind of struggled with it until I finally just decided, I don't believe in any of it, and it doesn't play into my life. I mean, a Ouija board, I wouldn't resist doing it. I wouldn't be afraid of doing it, but I suppose there are things that I would probably be like, no, I probably wouldn't do that. But I don't know. I'm not really aware. I mean, I don't really believe in any of it, but at the same time, I think we all have that capacity to have irrational fears that come up every now and again. But I think you're right in the sense that directors like Fulci and Alfred Soule and various other people who've dabbled with this kind of subject matter, they do it out of a place of kind of a personal investment, as opposed to just being, I want to take pot shots at something. I want to just, be controversial. I want to do something that's doesn't mean anything to me particularly, but I just want to, go and rankle some chains. And I think that's a very different kind of an approach versus somebody who's been immersed in something. They have some belief in it. They have some kind of relationship with it. They're kind of wrestling with it in a way that comes through in the film, which I think is more sincere, as opposed to the kind of cheap cynicism you're talking about that's evident in a lot of other films.
So I know I shouldn't bring up two examples just because it's a little off the beaten path, but two that always just kind of surprised me were very funny is that they condemned Catholicism, then they turned around and were like, but they're right, like a la Carta, because they're showing how bad the church is. In the very end, they're right. I mean, they are possessed by Satan. And Michele Soave's The Church, because they butcher the whole village and you feel horrible. And then they have them in the body pit and then they turn to demons. And I was like, wait a minute, they were demons. So it's, or did they turn to demons because what happened to them? It's just that weird kind of nice touch like that. I don't know. I'm getting a little off track. Should get back to City Living Dead.
Well, there are some films that are like that kind of send admittedly mixed messages. There was a sort of strain of Witchfinder movies in the late 60s and 70s that were very much inspired by the success of Michael Reeves' film Witchfinder General, which is based very much in reality. It's the historical figure, Matthew Hopkins, although it takes a lot of liberties, it's based in that. And then I suppose also Ken Russell's movie, The Devils, was also very influential in the sense there was a sort of, that kind of gave birth to the nunsploitation type films. But there was always kind of a weird schism that came up in some of these films where they would be based in a historical context. They would be obviously very critical of the hypocrisy of the things that were happening, the way that the church and people acting in the name of the church were abusing their power and so forth, in the way that Hopkins does, for example, knowingly accusing people just because he has a vendetta or whatever. But whenever they would apply kind of a supernatural element into the film, it sometimes made things a little bit kind of a mixed message there, because, you know, at the same time that these things are happening and women are being accused of being witches and it's not true, at the same time, but there are some, you know, supernatural and evil elements that are afoot. So it kind of muddies the waters a little bit. But that wasn't the case, certainly in something like The Devils or in Witchfinder General, for example.
Yeah.
Which again, they're based more in historical fact. I mean, The Devils is a very extreme film if you've ever seen it. I mean, it's extremely over the top to this day, but it's no worse than Aldous Huxley's book. Russell took everything out of that book, and things that may seem really kind of like, oh, that's just Ken Russell being over the top. No, it's in there. And it was all based out of historical research and so forth. So reality sometimes is stranger than fiction.
Oh yeah. If I had to compare, just to show how much more balls Fulci had than a lot of the other Italian directors, all you have to do is show the end of Don't Torture a Duckling to the end of Who Saw Her Die and say, see how this movie goes back on what it said, and Don't Torture a Duckling doubles down on it. Oop, my freaking thing.
Yeah.
Sorry about that.
Well, I mean, in defense of poor Aldo Lato, he was very opposed to that. He was very upset that they made that change. That was the producers kind of getting cold feet on the idea of, I don't know if we really want to go this far. So they make that change. I won't say specifically what happens for benefit of people who haven't seen it, but yeah, that was something he wasn't happy about. And for whatever reason, though, I mean, Fulci had a producer that believed in the project clearly and was able to back him up. Bearing in mind, too, that very often in Italian films and European films in general, directors tend to have a lot more control than they do in America, for example. Where in American films, it's relatively unusual for directors to have final cut and to be able to kind of control their films in that sense. I mean, John Carpenter has always fought for that, and famously, when he couldn't get it on something like Memoirs of an Invisible Man, the end result suffers because it's not really what he wants it to be. But he always fought to have that. In Italy, it's kind of a given. I mean, usually directors are kind of respected enough to be able to be allowed to do what they want to do. But in a case of a movie like Who Saw Her Die, which is otherwise a really good giallo, a really fine example of the genre, that little tweak at the end really does kind of take the wind out of its sails a bit.
So what I'm thinking is a lot of, we had a lot of like Gothic atmosphere with the Hammer films, and they did sprinkle in gore here, but I can't think of an earlier film really, maybe besides the Coffin Joe movies, which aren't exactly Gothic. I wouldn't say they are to a certain extent, maybe regional, some weird. But is there any other ones before City of the Living Dead that mix that Gothic atmosphere with that hardcore gore like that? I can't think of any.
Well, you mentioned Hammer. I mean, there was a very extreme sequence of gore in a movie called Dracula, Prince of Darkness, where Dracula is resurrected and they hang Charles Tingwell's body over the coffin and slit his throat, and the blood comes pouring down. For 1966, that was, strong stuff. Mario Bava, his stuff in the 60s was pretty strong. I mean, something like Black Sunday, for example, was actually banned in Great Britain for 8 years.
I forgot
And
the
for a
Mask
long
of
time,
Satan scene.
yeah,
Sorry.
for the Mask of Satan, but it was also the first Italian horror film to have the eye violence. There's a vampire gets his eye pierced with a spike at one point. And that's in black and white, and it's filmed in a very sort of stylized way, but it was pretty extreme for 1960, 61. And some of Baba's other things, like especially Blood and Black Lace for 1964, was very, very strong in terms of its physical violence. Still is. I mean, the blood is deliberately, I would argue, deliberately very stylized and phony, but there's a real physicality to the violent scenes, the murder scenes and so forth, that I think still holds up all these years later. So, I mean, things like that, obviously, but there weren't a ton of them. I mean, usually when you're talking about sort of hardcore gore films, you're usually talking about the Herschel Gordon Lewis kind of school. But then, of course, in the late 60s, with people like Romero coming in with Night of the Living Dead, which was a major game changer. And then into the 70s, as gradually you started to get more films like Living Dead at Manchester Morgue, which is another one that's fairly gory for its time.
Yeah, for sure.
But Fulci really, I think, was the one who took that and ran with it in a really distinctive way, in a way that was kind of unusual for its time. Because one thing to look at a Herschel Gordon Lewis movie, which is, whatever you think of his movies, if you like them, you don't like them, whatever, if you enjoy them, they're crude, they're cheap. The gore is not convincing. I mean, they were shocking for 60s audiences, I'm sure, but they're not convincing. Whereas you start looking at some of the stuff that Fulci's starting to work into his films, especially in the early 70s, like Lizard and Woman's Skin, which is not a gore film, but it's got some shocking moments in it, including one that landed him in court because they were concerned that he had actually eviscerated some dogs for a scene, which he didn't. It was a special effect. But there were things like that. I mean, we could also point to the Italian cannibal films as well. They're also into this mix.
Yeah.
So around the same time that Zombies coming out, for example, we've got Deodato coming out with Cannibal Holocaust, and before that, Lenzi had done Man from Deep River. So movies like that were also into that mix too.
So do you think City of the Living Dead or Gates of Hell changed the 1980 landscape in horror movies at all? I mean, because there was a lot of extreme gore in 1980 as it was, but do you think that it actually changed anything when that came out? Do you think people were trying to top it?
It's hard to answer that because, in the Italian film scene, yeah, I'm sure everybody was sort of watching the competition and everybody was trying to sort of one up each other. And you kind of get that sense when you look at some of the other things from that year. Andrea Bianchi comes out with Burial Ground. Bruno Mattei comes out with Hell of the Living Dead, or Zombie Creeping Flesh, whatever you want to call it. Massachesi comes out with Anthropophagus and Beyond the Darkness and things like that. And you do get a sense that they're all kind of aware of what everybody else is doing, and they're kind of, trying to one up each other to a certain extent. In a wider sense, it's harder to say because some of these films didn't get the greatest distribution. I mean, City of the Living Dead came out over here. It was called The Gates of Hell. I don't believe it came out over here to around 1983. So I don't know that it was really that influential on a big kind of sweeping scale right away. But ultimately it was. I mean, ultimately there were a lot of filmmakers who saw it, who were impressed by it, and who tried to emulate its mixture of atmosphere and gore. I mean, the same year City of the Living Dead comes out, Carpenter comes out with Fog, which was his attempt to do a kind of old-fashioned Val Lewton style horror film. But then he realizes when it's put together, it doesn't work. It needs some jumps, it needs some scares, it needs a little bit of punctuation points. So he changed it pretty radically. Went back and did heavy-duty post-production work on it and reshoots and everything else. So you get a little bit of gore, but City of the Living Dead and the Fog, I think they have a kind of similar atmosphere. They have a similar kind of feel of that sort of small town, the very misty kind of ambiance, a lot of nighttime scenes and so forth. They're very elegant in many respects, but obviously City of the Living Dead is far more extreme in terms of gore than anything. Well, really, arguably anything a Carpenter would do, at least up until something like Vampires in the late 90s.
So how do you think it stacks in terms of quality against its contemporaries? And we use Internet Movie Database, knowing that a lot of these movies didn't get wide releases in the States or whatever, you know what I mean? So 1980 is a much more stacked year than one who lived here at the time would know. But how do you think it's top 5, top 10? What's it looking like?
Probably top 5. I mean, it's hard to say though, because okay, there's The Shining. Obviously, that's a huge one for me. I love The Shining. The Fog. I'm very fond of that one as well. City of the Living Dead would almost have to be up there in the top 5. Dress to Kill was out that year too, so that's another big one. There was a lot of good stuff that year. I mean, I suppose the big sort of watershed movie of the year was Friday the 13th, which maybe would make like my top 15, I suppose, of that year. But a lot of the other stuff I tend to prefer. I mean, it's leaps and bounds ahead of the other Italian films of that year, I think, in terms of the kind of gory horror films that were coming out that year. I'd put it well ahead of things like Burial Ground. As much as I love Burial Ground, I think it's a ton of fun. I do think City of the Living Dead is much better than the other Italian films. There were some other good ones. I mean, there was Lamberto Bava made his first film that year, Macabre, which is a really interesting film that I highly recommend. But a lot of the other ones are again kind of fitting far more into that kind of run of imitation films. And there's also Cannibal Holocaust. And Cannibal Holocaust, regardless of whatever you think about it, whether you approve of it or disapprove of it, I mean, I don't approve of things in it.
Yeah, I feel the same way.
It doesn't matter because it's done. I mean, you can't change. You can censor it, but what's the point? It's not going to change anything. So it's they did what they did. But it's a beautiful film, and we really need to look at it. It's very powerful, and it does what it's supposed to do. And Deodato came out with another film that same year, House by the Edge of the Park, which I'm also very fond of too. So yeah, it was a very good year.
We also have, I think you're a big fan of Inferno as well.
Oh God, I can't believe I forgot that. Yeah, well, Inferno. Yeah, Inferno would definitely be top 5.
Yeah, so we're doing that retro year. So I'm watching 160 movies, rewatching a lot of them, and I'm sitting here and I'm like, it's going to be hard to come up with a top 25 without leaving titles I like, because there's some weird Asian ones too that are kind of like, they're not exactly horror, but we do exploitation and stuff. So when you mix in like the Lost Souls, which is just a movie that's just in 1980 is just incredibly mean spirited. Like it's still 1970 mentality. Like it's just no happy endings at all.
No. Well, I mean, a lot of those films were shot in 79 too.
Yeah.
So, I mean, that's something to bear in mind too. They may have came out in 80, but they would have been shot in 79. Inferno was shot in 79. City of the Living Dead was actually shot in 80. It was shot in the spring. It was shot around April of 1980. So it is, indisputably 1980, but Inferno, which is a much bigger film with a much bigger budget and much more ambitious, that was shot in partially in New York, but mostly in Italy in 1979. And that's a magnificent film too. I'm very, very fond of that one. It's actually my favorite of the trilogy. I like it even more than Suspiria, which I know isn't the common opinion, but there you go.
I'm close to. I don't know which one I prefer. I mean, the Three Mothers is pretty hard to top, though, right? Or the third.
Well, yeah. I mean, that's let's cut to the chase. Yeah, that's the undisputed masterpiece, isn't it?
Yeah.
Huh.
I mean, it's no Card Player, but.
Well, I like the Card Player. I'll stick up for the Card
That's
Player,
the one I really don't like.
I don't like Mother of Tears, Giallo, or Dracula. I can't say.
Oh, I hate Giallo.
It was bad, although I think Dracula's even worse. But Dracula,
but it's funnier.
They all have their moments. They all
it's
have their
funnier,
moments.
Though, for me.
Well, it is. Yeah, it's not meant to be, but it is. Yeah, I mean, those 3 films in a row were pretty bad. But he came out with a new film this year, which I think is much, much better, and I highly recommend it.
I'm gonna get it for sure.
Ordinary. Yeah, it's a good film.
So I mean that's the one thing too, is people always say, well, Fulci, his last movies, some of them were pretty bad. In particular, Door to Silence, I don't care for. But I know some people probably think it's better than a lot of Argento's latter stuff. But the thing is, if Fulci would have continued, would his films have ended up just like Dario Argento's, honestly? Because
Fulci died just as he was preparing to do a film for Dario Argento, which could have been a big boost to him. The Wax Mask. He was going to direct, and of course, Fulci passed away from complications of diabetes. And it ended up being directed by Sergio Stivoletti, who completely reworked the script into a more special effects heavy movie than Fulci had in mind. If you've seen that film, and there's all this sort of dumb stuff at the end that goes kind of Terminator-esque and whatnot, that wasn't part of Fulci's concept at all. That wasn't. The best scene in the film actually was a scene that Fulci had outlined in his script. It's the scene involving a sort of doppelganger, which is punctuated with
that is a good scene.
Blood on a gramophone record. Very, very good scene. And that's a scene that Fulci had outlined himself. So, that tells you something. But the problem with Fulci's last films, and I think a lot of them are a lot better than they're given credit for, you have to be realistic and understand that, first of all, the man himself was very sick. After a certain point, he was suffering from a variety of ailments. He had diabetes. He had contracted hepatitis. He was not in very good shape for a lengthy period of time. Desperately needed the work, wanted the work. I mean, the Italian film industry collapsed in the 1980s, thanks largely to television. This is why a lot of those directors in the 70s who had made a lot of interesting films, like Alberto De Martino or Sergio Martino or Enzo Castellari, started doing all these kind of bland, anonymous films and a lot of TV work, because that's all they could get going. Lenzi, who actually had pretty good track record, I think, through the 70s, going back to the 60s with his adventure films and things like that, all the way through his films in the 70s. In the 80s, he started to struggle because everybody was starting to struggle, apart from Dario Argento, who had built up his own little kind of mini empire, which he was able to keep going up to a point. But then, unfortunately, made a string of films that weren't very successful, and that kind of fell apart for him, too. But in terms of what Fulci was doing, he wanted to keep working. He needed to keep working just financially. And the ideas were still there. There are good ideas in those films. He just didn't have access to the good collaborators anymore. So he didn't have Sergio Savati and Luigi Caviller to do the camera work. He didn't have Gennaro De Rossi doing the makeup effects and so forth. And the films ended up suffering on that level. But I actually would stand up for most of them. You mentioned Door to Silence. I know a lot of people don't like it. I don't really understand why it was made, and Fulci didn't understand why it was made, because he said that Massachesi, or Joe D'Amato, if you prefer, who produced the film, just fell in love with that story and wanted him to shoot it. He said, but why? It's a guy in a car. Nobody's going to want to watch it. No, it'd be great.
He's just doing this the whole time.
Yeah, he's
Savage.
just driving in his car. But, it's got a kind of weird, dreamy, sort of sweaty texture to it that I like. I find it interesting. It's almost like an overextended Twilight Zone.
Exactly.
So maybe I'm a little more sympathetic to it. I mean, it's not a great last film. It's not bad. I mean, I think Demonia and Ghost of Sodom were pretty bad. But there's some really good ones in there, too, like House of Clocks. I think Cat in the Brain is a really fascinating movie. It's a mess, but it's a fascinating movie. It's fun, and it's got, wouldn't it have been fun if Mario Bava could have done a film like, he never would have. I mean, he was too camera shy, but
Yeah.
Wouldn't it have been fun to see him do something like that, or get Argento to do something like that, where he's just, playing a version of himself in a film? That'd be a lot of fun. I enjoy that film for that reason. Touch of Death, I think, is very enjoyable too. The ideas are bigger than the budget allows, and so they're concepts that don't quite work out, but I think they're interesting films. I think their hearts are in the right place, and I don't get a feeling that he's checked out and he doesn't care.
Yeah, I don't think he doesn't care. I never got that impression, and I don't get that impression from Dario ever either. And like you said earlier, that's almost like everybody in that way, like Romero too. Like, he doesn't have his crew. He doesn't have his Pittsburgh people. He doesn't have the people. You're only as good as your crew and people around him. It's a film. It's made by a bunch of people, not just Romero or Fulci. So when you don't, and the Italian film industry, like you said, it's gone. Like, I don't know how you expect these people, like Argento can't do those great crane shots he did in Tenebrae anymore. Nobody. So that's part of the beauty of it. So I don't understand how you expect people to make movies when they did visuals and stuff like that. Was what the selling point was immediately.
Yeah, if you look at something like Opera, this is a man who's working at a peak level of inventiveness, but he's got the time, and he's got the money, and he can get the great collaborators, and so he's got these nutty ideas, and he can get people who can realize them for him. That there was, after that, I'm not one of these people who thinks Argento lost it after opera. Far from it. I like quite a few of the films he made after. I think the stuff he did in America is far better than people give it credit for. I love the Stendhal Syndrome.
I love Stendhal and Sleepless myself.
Yeah, I think Sleepless is a good film. I like family opera, and I know I'm one of the very few people who like it. I think it's an interesting film. There are, like I said, there are three that I'm just like, I don't have anything nice to say about them. But, I mean, it is difficult, especially when you make films over a long period of time and you're reasonably prolific. We're not talking Sergio Leone. We're not talking Stanley Kubrick, people who leave behind very small bodies of work because they spend years preparing. You're talking about people who've been in the business for a long time and they're reasonably prolific. It's rare to find people who have a really consistent batting average. I think Polanski has never made a bad film. Say what you want to about him as a human being, but as a filmmaker, I don't think he's ever made a bad film. And this is a guy who's been making films now for 60 years. And he's got another one in the works now. And I think that's pretty amazing. Romero was a case of somebody who unfortunately became a victim of his early success, and people had a hard time letting him go outside of that box. He wanted to do other things. He had other ideas. There were great projects that we never got to see because he couldn't get the money for them. So that's why at the end, only thing he can get going were zombie movies. Well, of those last four films, which were, it's not like a decade in between the first two and the better part of a decade between the second one and the third one. They're just running on top of each other. That's a problem. But I actually think three of those four films are worthy films. I think a couple of them are actually, really, really strong. So I think it's, as you say, the crew, the atmosphere, everything changes. He went up to Pittsburgh, or he went from Pittsburgh up to Canada, and it was just a different group of people up there. And it didn't give you quite the same flavor as what he was doing in Pittsburgh, which is part of what made him special. John Carpenter had his crew for a long time too, and then that sort of changed. And so the feel of the film started to change a bit. But there again, a lot of people say, well, after They Live, he was done. No, not at all. I think he made some outstanding films after that. Same with Argento and same with Fulci. I don't think that Fulci was kind of done after that period of like 1982, 83.
No, he had lots of good stuff.
He had some really good films after that. Things like The Devil's Honey, which is a really fine film. And a lot of the other films too. I mean, Enigma is a strange film. It's a goofy film in some respects, but I'm very fond of it. Voices from Beyond, the two La Casa films is House of Clocks and The Sweet House of Horrors. They're worthwhile. I mean, they're enjoyable little movies. And
I'm a big fan of New Gladiators myself.
Yeah,
I watched that one a bunch of times. And predates Running Man.
It does. It does. I mean, they were all sort of predated by things like The 10th Victim, the Elio Petri film from the mid-'60s, which is, again, dealing with that kind of, live television, reality TV game show.
Well, Rollerball too, right?
Yeah, Rollerball was before. Yeah, I mean, there were all these kinds of things that were kind of unusually prescient in terms of what ended up happening later on. We haven't got to the stage where we're killing people yet, but I wouldn't put it past us the rate we're going. I like New Gladiators. I mean, again, it's one of those movies. It needed a few more million. It needed more money than he had, but within the boundaries of what he had, and especially, if you compare that film to some of those other kind of post-apocalyptic, post-nuke movies that were being made in Italy during that time, some of them were good, like the ones that Castellari did. They're energetic and they're fun. Some of them were pretty bad, and what Fulci was able to pull off, again, with a good crew, a good cinematographer, and some good special effects artists on a lowish budget, although lavish compared to what he had later on.
Yeah,
it's pretty impressive.
So just a couple quick more questions about City of the Living Dead. So how would you put Father Thomas up against, I guess, I know they call him a loose trilogy. They call him the Gates of Hell trilogy. I don't think House by the Cemetery is not the Gates of Hell. It's more like the Catriona MacColl or whatever trilogy. So how do you put Schweik or Schweik? I always say his name wrong. Schweik, Father Thomas, and Dr. Freudstein.
Dr. Freudstein. Dr. Freudstein and Schweik. Yes, that's a good point. I'm glad you brought that up. House by the Cemetery is, I would argue, it's not even a zombie movie. He's not dead. He's experimenting on himself to keep himself alive. He's sort of organ harvesting. So it's not really a zombie.
Battle Beyond the Stars guys do, right? John Saxon.
Yeah, something like that. they lump them together because he looks freaky and he looks scary and all that, but he's not dead. He's
It's
just
a ghost story too.
Yeah, there you go. It's a strange film and it's a movie I'm very fond of, but it's not really a zombie movie in the conventional sense at all. So I think it's very different. In terms of those, I mean, they're all very distinctive. I mean, Freudstein is certainly a frightening figure. So is Spike when he comes back and his face is all, disfigured and all of that. I like Father Thomas, though, in the sense that, I don't know, maybe it's just because I have just enough of a kind of cynicism about Catholicism in my background that I like the idea of a kind of malevolent, undead priest that goes around making people barf their guts out. I don't know. I like him very much. Played very well by an actor named Fabrizio Jovena, who was one of the very few actors that Fulci was good friends with. And he used him also in a movie he made right around that same time. As a matter of fact, right before, he did a film called Contraband, which is a Polizieski film, which he ended up leaving before it was quite finished. He left it in the hands of his assistant to finish it so he could come back and work on preparing City of the Living Dead. So he's in those two films, and he was also in Seven Notes in Black or The Psychic. So I guess he would be my favorite of the three, even though he's the least. He's the one with the least special effects to him. He's just kind of pancakey face, but I think he's very kind of alarming and disturbing character.
I didn't appreciate him as much until this viewing, actually. I like all three of them, but the other two are just much more scary looking. But I guess it's funny because I'm not like a big metalhead or anything, but I can just see the metalhead horror fans just seeing a priest coming back from life and making people puke their guts, just putting the devil horns up. Like, I don't know if there's anything more metal than that in a horror film.
Yeah. Well, not surprisingly, Fulci is very popular among the kind of metal crowd, and which makes sense. I mean, people with kind of rebellious streak are going to appreciate him because he was a very rebellious filmmaker.
Indeed. And as far as the cast is concerned, there's a lot of great people in this. So all the European cult actors or people that appear in the cult films, who had the best resume in 1980? I mean, Giovanni Lombardo Radice, Christopher George was in a few, Janet Agren.
Well, Radice was just getting started. As a matter of fact, City of the Living Dead was his first film. I get them mixed up because they were done close.
I think it was third.
Was it the third? Okay, so his first was probably
House
on the Edge of the Park. Yeah, House on the Edge of the Park, and then
Cannibal Apocalypse.
No, Cannibal Apocalypse. Yes, that's right. And then this one, and then he did Cannibal Ferox. Yeah.
Yep.
He was just getting started. I mean, the funny part about him was he said that Michele Soavi was supposed to play the character in House on the Edge of the Park and the character in City of the Living Dead, and Fulci and Deodato ended up casting him instead because, I mean, obviously he's a much better actor. I mean, Soavi's a wonderful character, and Soavi's in City of the Living Dead, of course, as you know. He plays the guy that's out with Daniela Doria, having a little makeout session in the van, and then Father Thomas shows up. The best, I mean, there were so many interesting people that were sort of floating in and out of these films. I mean, the guy that I like the best in this film is Christopher George, who's an American actor who unfortunately died not that long afterwards. He and Fulci did not get along. Apparently there was not much love lost there. I'm not sure if Christopher George took this film particularly seriously. There's indications that probably he didn't. But I really like what he brings to the film in terms of that sort of sly humor. And he has a great interplay with Catriona MacColl. As a matter of fact, when I interviewed her, we were talking about him, and she said, "No, he was very handsome and he was very nice, but he was kind of remote, and he didn't really interact with me all that much." And she said, "I thought that I had much better chemistry with David Warbeck." And I said, "I actually really liked what you did with Christopher George in that film. I thought it came across really well." And she was very surprised to hear that. She liked hearing it. I guess, obviously the fan favorite is David Warbeck because of The Beyond and all of that. But I really like what Christopher George, and there are these little ad libs, and they had to have been ad libs because Fulci and Sacchetti wouldn't have written some of these lines. When they get to the cemetery and he said, "Oh, it's a good thing he wasn't buried at Arlington." Fulci and Sacchetti wouldn't have written that. No. Some of those lines like, "You're the one who got me out here in the armpit of the world looking for your galloping cadavers," and just things like that. He's terrific. Carlo De Mejo is another one in this film that I like. He's actually the son of Alita Valli, who people might remember from movies like The Third Man, but also Suspiria.
Eyes Without a Face as well, right?
Eyes Without a Face, Lisa and the Devil, all kinds of great films, big and small. He was her son, and he didn't have as big a career as she did, but he did a bunch of these films around this time. He was also in Manhattan Baby. He's in House by the Cemetery. As a matter of fact, he plays the kind of creepy head librarian.
He's in Terror Express as well this year, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah.
And he
Terror
plays
Express.
a polar opposite character in that movie. It's funny because he's like an older, seemingly professor in this, and the other one he's like a young kid rapist. So it's like they didn't care about age, I guess, or who looked what age, but
no, you can tell they put a little bit of gray in his temples, but it's mostly just in his acting. I mean, he plays it much more sort of sedate in this versus the way he played Terror Express. So he's a lot of fun too. But there's so many other actors who kind of came in and out. I mean, I always loved Richard Johnson, who was in Zombie.
He's great.
He was such a wonderful, wonderful stage actor and had been in big films and had no snobbery about doing these movies at all. I remember I interviewed him not long before he passed away. And he said, I have the greatest job in the world. He said, I can't complain about any of it. It doesn't matter what film it is or whatever. I just like the work. So he always brought that attitude to it. There was no snootiness about it whatsoever. But and of course, Catriona MacColl. I mean, we have to mention her. She was this was her first film for Fulci. She did 2 more, The Beyond and House by the Cemetery. She ended up being married for a period of time to John Finch, the actor who starred in Frenzy and Macbeth for Polanski. Although they ended up getting divorced later on, but both of them had connections to Ridley Scott as well. She's briefly, very, very briefly, in a movie that Ridley Scott did called A Good Year with Russell Crowe. And John Finch had originally been cast as Kane in Alien, but he ended up getting sick and he was recast by John Hurt. But he is in Kingdom of Heaven in that film. It was actually his last film. So that was a nice little connection there. But I really like Catriona MacColl because she brings a lot of humanity and a lot of intelligence and a lot of backbone to her character. So even if on the page it wasn't a particularly well-developed role, you get a sense of a real human being out of her in the film. And I like the fact that she has a certain, you hate to use words like pluckiness, and it seems so cliche, but she has a certain strong-willed quality to her that's very appealing. So she doesn't just come across as the usual kind of screing victim or anything. She seems
like sweet and smart, like the type of person that you would want to marry because she's going to set you straight, and she's better than you. So you're like,
basically, yeah. No, she's very good. And Daniela Doria too, who we mentioned, the girl barfs her guts out in one of the most famous sequences. Fulci liked her. She liked him too. I mean, she said that he was very kind to her. He had a reputation for being very nasty, and he could be, but if he liked you, he treated you well. And he put her through some very nasty death scenes in his films. I mean, she's killed off in this, and then The Black Cat, and House by the Cemetery, and very memorably in The New York Ripper, most notorious scene in that film where she's tied down to the bed and completely, razor blade through the eyeball, razor blade through the nipple. Yeah, it's a very nasty sequence, but he liked her. So there you go. Brought her back over and over again, essentially to play victims, but she did it well. And Janet Agren, who you mentioned too, is another welcome presence. She did a bunch of these. She's also in Eaten Alive this same year for Umberto Lenzi, the kind of basically cannibal version of Jonestown.
Got a good cast though.
Yeah, well, Mel Ferrer and Robert Kerman and Venantino Venantini, I believe, is in it. And
Ivan Rasimov's in it too, I believe.
Ivan Rasimov essentially playing Jim Jones. Yep. I think Venantini might be in. He might be in Cannibal Ferox.
He's in Cannibal Apocalypse for sure.
He is in that for sure, but I think he might be in Cannibal Ferox. But regardless, and of course Venantini is in City of the Living Dead along with his son, who plays Little John in the film, who is fortunately much, much, much better dubbed than poor Giovanni Frazza is as Bob in House by the Cemetery. That's a good performance that everybody knocks because he was dubbed by an older woman.
So sick of hearing about Bob. People are like, it ruins the whole movie. I was like, who gives a shit? It's like, who cares? Like, I hate arguing about the same things over. It literally kills me. It makes me hate myself and other horror fans because of it.
It's a good performance if you look at what he's doing. It's a tough part for a little kid to play. They just dubbed him. It must have been a mature woman trying to sound like a child, and it's laughable. But it doesn't mean it's a bad performance. I think he's very good, actually. But yeah, people love to harp on some of those things.
One comedic thing that I noticed when we were watching, I put this on because I've seen this a bunch of times. So I wanted to show, when you watch something like this again, I'm like, I want to watch it with somebody who hasn't seen it just to see what they think. And I've been showing them a lot of the 1980 movies, and they watched this. And one of my friends pointed out in the bar scene, you have all these like grizzled kind of like superstitious kind of people that Fulci's going to definitely punish in the movie, which I love that scene when they do bite it. But there's this extra in the background, and this is supposed to be Dunwich, so you assume New England, which there's a guy. Did you ever notice this guy with a cowboy hat? That's like, he looks like the most forced extra I've ever seen.
Yeah.
We almost laughed till we were in tears because we kept this stupid ongoing joke that it was a nacho hat and it was the lunch and all sorts of stuff.
They would do this sort of thing all the time, and of course, I mean, they very often would shoot in the U.S. They did shoot in Savannah and other places around Georgia for this film, the exteriors, but the interiors, for the most part, would have been shot in Rome. So usually what they'll do in these movies, you'll notice if it's supposed to be in America, they just put like an American flag out, or they have an American flag on the wall, or a picture of Ronald Reagan or something like that. And they do the same thing, like if the movie's set in England, they just put a picture of the Queen up on the wall, and all of a sudden it's England. But yeah, they do that sometimes. But it's fair in the sense that we do the same thing. Every time we have Italians in films, we have them depicted a certain way. So it's fun every now and again to see like the English or the Italians or whatnot do the American stereotype. So it's usually some guy with a cowboy hat chewing gum or smoking a cigar. And that's usually their idea of what Americans are like. So I think it's kind of funny.
So, I mean, I don't really have any last words on City of the Living Dead.
Well, I mean, it's a movie that I remember the first time I saw it was right when I was getting into Fulci. It wasn't a film that I saw when I was much younger. I didn't really get into Fulci until around 95. That was like a year that I just became obsessed with Italian horror films, and Fulci was a big part of that experience. And I watched it right back to back with Zombie. Seeing Zombie in widescreen for the first time just knocked me away. I thought it was an amazing film and loved it. And then I watched City of the Living Dead, which seemed kind of grubby and cheap and a little bit, uninspired by comparison. Flash forward a few years, and I still love Zombie, but I like City of the Living Dead better. I like the atmosphere. I like the sort of rambling structure of it. It has just a little bit of a plot going, this whole investigation and this kind of race against the clock. But it's ultimately, it's just an excuse for one atmospheric sequence after another, which really kind of comes to its biggest expression in The Beyond, which Fulci made a deliberately plotless film. But I always thought The Beyond, to me, it felt like he was trying a little too hard there, whereas this one, it was just like, it just works. Everything about this movie, there's just something weird and offbeat about everything. I mean, even that scene early on when the policeman comes in and he's interrogating Teresa, the medium, and the other people. Where are the drugs? Down the toilet? And all that. It's just this wonderfully weird, sort of strange, offbeat quality the whole way through the film that I think is absolutely enchanting. So it's a movie I could put on. I could certainly watch it once a year at least. It has never diminished in terms of entertainment value for me.
And I know we briefly touched on it, how Lovecraftian it is, but most definitely, like, and it's funny because I love Stuart Gordon's movies, but they're not very Lovecraftian. His early stuff, Dagon is surprise, but as far as like Reanimator is not, but that was the most least Lovecraftian story Lovecraft wrote, if that makes any sense. So it kind of makes sense. But I just am amazed when you compare it to like the Dunwich Horror, the Haunted Palace, how much more Lovecraftian it is, especially the scenes in the street with the zombies jumping down and more like disappearing and reappearing and stuff. Like, it's just perfect. Like, so would you say this is the most Lovecraftian of the horror films? I feel like Fulci is the most Lovecraftian director.
Probably. I mean, in terms of, looking at films like this and The Beyond and House by the Cemetery, especially concentrating on those three right there, I think he captures that atmosphere. I mean, I love the Stuart Gordon films too, but I wouldn't describe something like The Reanimator as being an atmospheric film. It isn't. It isn't that. It's over the top. It's witty. It's outrageous. It's a lot of fun, but it's not an atmospheric film.
No.
As you said, that Reanimator is kind of an atypical Lovecraft story, so it doesn't have quite that same vibe as the other ones do. So that's okay. But I think that's probably a fair statement. I think Soave gets close to it a little bit in things like the Church and the Sect and Della Morte Della More. But Fulci, I think he definitely managed to capture some of that magic. And John Carpenter, I mentioned too, with his films like In the Mouth of Madness, Prince of Darkness, and The Thing. There's just that sense of conveying something that is beyond description, which is a big thing. That's the problem with Lovecraft is full of all these awful things that cannot be described. But when it comes time to put them on film, we got to show them to some degree. And these filmmakers, I think Fulci, probably most out of any of them, were able to do that. Yeah, it might be zombies, but it's not always the conventional zombies. I mean, these are kind of the teleporting dead, aren't they? They just kind of appear and disappear. And they're not really flesh eaters in the way that other Italian zombies of the period are. They seem to drink blood, which almost makes them more like vampires. But they don't seem to really be all about, munching away at body parts in a way that they are, like in Zombie, for example. And the cannibal aspect is completely gone in the Beyond. I mean, doesn't even enter into it. So, I think that's a fair description to say that he probably, at the very least, was up there at the very top in terms of capturing that kind of atmosphere. Makes you wonder if he would have ever had a chance to do a proper Lovecraft adaptation, what it would have been like. He was involved tangentially in the Curse movie that David Keith made in the mid-80s. But contrary to what some people would have you believe, he did not really ghost direct the movie or anything like that. He was just in charge of some special effects sequences.
It sure don't feel like Fulci to me.
No, it's not. It was David Keith, but David Keith I think it was the first time he directed the picture, so he was relatively inexperienced, and they wanted to have somebody. It was kind of like with Antonio Margheriti on Flesh for Frankenstein, where you get Paul Morrissey to come over, who's always made these ad-libbed kind of movies. When there's some special effects type sequences that they wanted somebody who was more experienced to do, Margheriti did it. But other than that, it's a Paul Morrissey film. And it's the same way here with The Curse. It's a David Keith movie that's just got a couple of Fulci moments.
So I would like to get into just the zombie point a little bit, but I know I've kept you a little bit over. So do you have any plugs or anything like that? Unless you want to talk a little bit about the zombies. It's up to you.
Oh, what would you like to talk about with that?
I just want to bring up kind of see your take on it. I every week we have a new zombie movie and they say, is it a zombie movie? It's just like, if it was a vampire movie, the thousands of different vampires between movie to movie to movie, and werewolf, every rule's different. And like, there's supernatural zombies, there's infected zombies, there's dead zombies, there's alive zombies, there's smart, dumb zombies. There's a million types of zombies. So I just put all of them in a blanket now under the same umbrella.
I had a a testy exchange with somebody recently on this very topic, and it wasn't my intention that she get testy, but it got testy because the person was rude, at least in my opinion. There's a movie called The Sadness, which recently came out, which I liked very much. It's nothing new in terms of its story. It's kind of conventional, but I liked it. And I said, I don't think this is a zombie movie. I don't think that 28 Days Later is a zombie movie. I don't think Nightmare City is a zombie movie. These are contagion things, which to me is closer to something like The Crazies, or you could look at Cronenberg's Shivers, things
or Rabid,
like that.
even
Rabid. Now zombies, and this is an important point to understand. Of course, George Romero did not create zombies. He created the zombie as cannibal. That was his introduction. That was his twist. Him and John Russo. I guess we should give Russo some credit there too. But they were the ones who introduced the idea of the zombie as a cannibal. Prior to that, it was always either voodoo, as in White Zombie and I Walk with a Zombie, or it was mad science, as in movies like Creature with the Atom Brain or Revenge of the Zombies with John Carradine. But it always sort of relied on the idea of brain dead people. They were either dead and reanimated through magic somehow, or they were brain dead as a result of some scientific experiment. And usually the concept was that they would be used as cheap labor. There's a Hammer film called Plague of the Zombies.
Yep.
Which is, this Cornish squire uses them to work in his tin mill. Cheap labor. You don't have to pay them. So,
same as White Zombie.
Yeah, White Zombie did the same thing with the sugar fields. And so it was always, that or the mad science angle. When you're talking about Contagion, and it is admittedly a little bit of a landmine, and I can understand wanting to simplify it. I think it's different in a sense that, movies like 28 Days Later, certainly, I know in the case of Nightmare City, Lenzi was very, very insistent. He was very irritated every time anybody would say that it was a zombie movie. He got extremely irate about that.
But that one confuses me because they get shot, so they should be dead, but it takes a headshot to kill them. So it's like, I don't think you knew what you're doing exactly, Lenzi. They're superhuman.
It depends on where. I mean, and it could be that, were they getting them in a spot that would be fatal on the body, or were they just hitting them somewhere or other, but you get them in the head, that's going to do it.
Yeah.
A little bit of mixed signals there because, of course, that was popular at the time thanks to the Romero films. You got to shoot them in the head. That became the thing. But he was very insistent on that because, and actually they're vampires really, because they need blood. They need blood in order to keep their cells regenerating. So it was meant to be a zombie film. He didn't want to make a zombie film, so he changed it to mutants affected by radiation. So he was always very irritated when people would bring that up. Make of that what you will. I understand what he means, and I would agree. I think, yeah, they're infected people. Tom Savini famously said about 28 Days Later, they're not zombies, they're fucked up people. And yeah, he's right. I mean, it's a virus. They don't die. They're in the control of this rage virus. And the same thing with the sadness. The interesting thing with the sadness was this idea that these people were conscious of what they're doing, and they're so horrified by it that they're literally crying.
I love that aspect of it.
That they can't help themselves. And it's not just the violence, it's also the sexual violence. So they're doing all these really, really fucked up things, and they can't help it, and they know, and it's crying. So that was an interesting sort of twist on it. So I will say, yes, I think that there is a distinction to be made. I'm always a little prickly when it comes, like with Giallo, for example. People say, "Oh, this Spanish Giallo I watched." It's not Giallo. It's a film in the Giallo style, but a Giallo needs to be Italian, primarily Italian. Understanding that these films are usually financed by a whole slew of different countries, but primarily Italian. But the fight wages on. I mean, some people insist Suspiria is a Giallo. It's not, in my opinion.
It has Giallo things in there, but after the Giallo was
gloves,
made,
it's got the riddle, it's got murders and all that. But I mean, you just not every
I wouldn't
movie,
say it is.
It's a supernatural horror film. And
as a kid, I would, just because I didn't know any better. But now I would never. You know what I mean?
To me, it's like, it's so obvious it shouldn't even be a point of debate. But some people are very insistent. So after a certain point, you just have to say, okay, if that's what you think, you enjoy it however you want to enjoy it. But I think these things only, these words exist for a reason, and we should be careful with how we apply them, because if we just over apply them, they lose all meaning.
Yeah. So for zombies and infected, I just take the easy way out now. I just say zombie infected movies.
Zombie infected, pandemic movies, whatever you want to call it. I mean, I make a distinction, but I get it. I mean, ultimately, at the end of the day, City of the Living Dead's a zombie movie. Zombies a zombie movie. The Beyond, funnily enough, wasn't really meant to be a zombie movie. Fulci always said that the zombies were thrown in at the insistence of the German distributors, that they wanted zombies in it because those movies were popular. So I can buy that, actually, because there aren't really many zombies in it until you get to the end. I can buy that.
It gets all confused, though, because you look at it and you say, well, demons, they act just like zombies. They spread like zombies through the nails or the bites, but they're clearly demons. But then you're like, well, you look at
I've never heard anybody call Demons a zombie movie.
But it's not a zombie movie because they're demons, but they act just like zombies. And so it's stupid to argue. It's so pointless. That's what drives me crazy. It's just like, whatever, man, whatever you want. Just same thing with, is this the first slasher? It's impossible to pinpoint when that was. You know what I mean? Like, and that's what you said with the Giallo. Like, it's not a Giallo. After Giallos were in the movie history, every movie would use Giallo things. So like every movie after that has touches of the Giallo.
Yeah, I mean, you could draw. I mean, people say Psycho, but then talking of slashers, they say Psycho, but I mean, you have to understand Psycho was very influenced by Lady Diabolique, which came out in '55. And then prior to that, there was a film called The Spiral Staircase from 1946, a Robert Siodmak film, which was a big influence on Giallo, actually. Dario Argento and Lenzi and Fulci and Bava were all familiar with that film and drew from it. Their images in that film are like, oh my God, this is like, 30 years before we were seeing some of these things. So it nothing's created in a vacuum. I mean, ultimately, there is a certain big film that comes that's very successful. I mean, we say the slasher film is kind of born with Halloween. Okay, yeah. Some people would argue Halloween isn't a slasher film. Maybe it's too classy to be a slasher film. It depends on how you look at it. It's a thriller, a suspense film, a horror film, whatever you want to call it. But there were antecedents to that. There was Black Christmas. There was, of course, in Italy, films like Twitch of the Death Nerve by Mario Bava or Torso by Sergio Martino. And those were big kind of influence as well. So it's usually, there are links in a chain, but it usually does come down to a particular one that's very successful and very popular and that gets out there and people just decide to rip off. Halloween, you could say that in that sense because Halloween was the one that all of a sudden after that you had Friday the 13th and The Burning and My Bloody Valentine and all these other things, but many of them based around the idea of holidays. Although again, you could say Black Christmas did that too. Although Black Christmas was not profitable, certainly in the US, it was not a successful film. So it didn't really start the trend. But it's in the eye of the beholder. I mean, however you choose to look at it is fine. I'm not shy about saying what I think, and I will put my point of view out there. But if somebody enjoys it on a certain level and says that they think if they want to say Nightmare City is a zombie movie and they love it, then okay, it's fine. If that's what you think, have at it. I don't agree, but that's all right.
It doesn't really matter at the end of the day. It's your opinion. I mean, it's not hurting anybody's feelings. And if it does on that kind of level, okay, that's crazy. But
that's fandom for you. I mean, there is a tendency, to take opinions about movies and about artists and so forth very close to heart in a way that they shouldn't. And this is why fights escalate all the time. And this is why people get really unpleasant. And it doesn't need to happen. It's just kind of stupid, but it happens a lot. So it's
easy to do online too. You know what I mean? It's so easy to do on the computer because no, you're not going to look in somebody's face and get viciously angry at them for not liking Day of the Dead. But on the internet, you'll be like, I might be like, you're crazy. I don't want to take your opinions anymore, and then laugh and walk away because I'm fucking around. But I like on the internet, you'll tell somebody that they deserve to die, and you won't have to look at them. And it's just like, this is insane. Just don't say anything that you wouldn't say to somebody's face on the
keyboard warriors. Yeah. That's what they call them, keyboard warriors. And yeah, it happens all the time. I mean, yeah, I'll hear things that I think are ridiculous. I mean, especially these days. There's a lot of emphasis on the hot take. Everybody wants to have the hot take, listen to me, Howard the Duck is the greatest film of the 1980s. And they're saying it without irony. It's like, all right, well, if you're being serious and you want to make some points about that, I'll read it and I'll listen to you.
But they don't. They just say that. They just say that.
No, they don't. It's usually just that. Or people will say, no, Dracula 3D is the best Dario Argento movie. It's like, somebody did tell me that once. And when I asked for detail, didn't want to talk about it. So it's like, it's easy to say that. And it's easy also to be contrarian, just to be contrarian. I mean, I like some films that a lot of people don't like. I mentioned Argento's Phantom of the Opera, which is not a beloved film. I like that film. I've liked it since I first saw it in '99. I'm not saying that to be contrarian. I'm not saying that. I will explain why I like it. If somebody wants to listen, I'll detail it. I mean, you can listen to a commentary I did for it for the Blu-ray. You can read about it in my book about Argento, whatever. But I mean, I'm prepared to back it up. But a lot of people aren't prepared. It's just, it's always these articles that you see, making a case for some terrible film or whatever, and making an argument it's a great film, but then they don't back it up with anything interesting. If you're going to say it, then at least give me something to work with. Give me some interesting points that I can think about. I mean, if you want to go out and say Citizen Kane is the most overrated movie ever made, you're allowed to do that. But give me an article, give me some backup to get me to understand why you think that, because otherwise you're just saying it to be obnoxious.
Yeah. I never ever get annoyed from anyone when they love a movie I don't like. I'm like, cool, man. Maybe I'll like it eventually, but I do sometimes get annoyed with people that hate stuff for the dumbest reasons, or they just hate. I don't. It just drives me crazy. I just ignore them. I just stop taking their opinion. If too many bad hot takes, it's just that's enough of that. I know it sounds stupid and close-minded, but it's just why give myself a headache.
It's like the whole superhero thing that's going on now, and all these people get all pissed off at people like Scorsese for saying that they don't like them. First of all, a man was asked a question, he answered it. Second of all, you shouldn't be surprised that superhero movies aren't his go-to. I mean,
he's a grandpa.
Why would you think that? And it's okay. I mean, he's a man who knows more than most of us about film.
Yeah.
About film history. He is a credible source, and he's allowed to have an opinion. And what he said wasn't anything bad. It really wasn't that bad. You had people like Francis Ford Coppola and Cronenberg come out afterwards and say far worse things.
Yeah.
But then it turns into trying to psychoanalyze why you don't like these movies, or trying to psychoanalyze why you do. Don't worry about what people like that you don't like or whatever. If they like something you don't like, that's okay. You don't have to try and figure out why they're emotionally regressive or whatever. It's okay. If that's what they like, let them like it. And by the same token, you don't have to be there being so touchy about liking something that this other guy doesn't like that you have to sort of take him down a couple of pegs because he doesn't like it.
Yeah.
I don't have to like it. I don't like superhero movies myself. I'm sorry. I don't care for them. It's just not my thing. But it doesn't bother me that people like them. I do understand the point that there's too many of them and that they clog up too much of the Cineplex and so forth. I get that, and I agree with that. But they're making money, and that's the nature of it. It's the business, so they're going to do it as long as they're making money. But it doesn't indicate a deficiency because you don't appreciate them any more than it indicates a deficiency because you do appreciate them. So just like what you like and don't worry about everything else. It's okay. What I've always asked anybody, and this is why, since social media has risen to what it's become, and everybody is a critic, and everybody is, but everybody's got a platform and everybody can go out and say these things. Very, very few people actually know how to write about film in a coherent and pleasurable way. Whether you agree with them or not, very few people are actually able to write about things that have some substance and that can make you think and that can make you understand, okay, I understand, even if I don't agree with him, I understand where he's coming from. I understand where she's coming from. Very few people can do that. It's usually just, oh, this is fucking awesome, or it's just the worst thing ever. And it's what you get over and over and over again. And you see it with so many, everybody's got a blog and everybody's got a YouTube channel and everybody's got this.
And it's all hyperbole. It's always exaggerated.
It's mostly hyperbole and garbage, most of it. And most of it is not worth reading. But, there are some good people and ones who can write about it in a way that's hopefully coherent and, I try to put things into context. I always try to get people to understand the context in which certain things are being created, if they're part of a certain trend or something like that. Trying to explain the good points as well as the bad points and so forth. It shouldn't just be about salivating over everything. It shouldn't just be about pissing over everything. There's toxic negativity. There's also toxic positivity. I've seen this a lot too, where fans who are so into horror films says, we need to support the community. We need to stop bad-mouthing these movies. Like, you don't have to lap up a piece of shit just because it's a horror movie. If it's bad, say so.
My friend was an independent director, so he was an independent horror director. So he's a part of that independent horror community. And there was a big group of people that said, we need to support everything. And he said, no, you don't. Don't support me if you don't like my movie. Support what you like. And
that's what the good stuff.
Or support what you like,
Support the good stuff, and whether it's low budget or big budget. And that's the other thing too, is kind of snobbery exists in so many different forms. It's not just the mainstream; it's also the community as well. Because a lot of people are very, very anti-mainstream. If something is made of, I don't watch Hollywood movies. Why don't you watch Hollywood movies? There's some good movies that are made every year.
watch
people
a
say,
little
oh,
bit of
there's no-
everything. People that watch
Yeah.
one thing, they have a lack of knowledge. They don't understand a lot of things if they only watch one type of thing.
Yeah. And I mean, and it's okay to say, you know what, this type of thing isn't really my thing. I'm not going to waste my time watching.
Yeah.
That's why I don't really watch much in the way of soup. I've seen some.
You give them a chance, though, or something a chance, at least.
I remember going to see The Joker and thinking, you know, this to me feels like Taxi Driver crossed with The King of Comedy, and I would much rather watch Taxi Driver or The King of Comedy. It's not for me. It's okay. Some people thought it was wonderful. I watched the Christopher Nolan Dark Knight movies and all that stuff. It's not for me. So after a certain point, it is okay to say this just isn't, you know, I'm not going to bother with it.
Yeah.
But you should be aware that every year there's good stuff that comes out, and say nothing is good anymore, everything is terrible.
That's
It's
a
just
product of getting old. A lot of people, you know, that don't register that that's what it is.
It is a product of getting old, but it happens with young people too. I've seen this. A lot of people who are just very, I don't want to watch anything that's made beyond 1985 or whatever. Like, okay. I mean, you could go all of your life and just watch, you know, up until that time, and you'd have, that's fine. I mean, that's perfectly okay. But it's when people won't shut up about it, and they keep saying it over and over again, and every opportunity that they get. This is the thing that I always get irritated with, and I am getting far afield of the subject here. But when I post about something that I like, and I put it out there, and people just feel compelled to come in and say, oh, that sucked. I didn't ask you.
Just let it be.
If I post and say, boy, I really like this. What does everybody else think? That's fine, because you've opened that door. And so, yes, if people want to come in. But if I just come in and say, boy, you know, The Irishman, I thought that was one of the greatest movies I've seen in the last 10 years. That sucked. I didn't ask you.
and at least tell me something reasonable. You know what I mean?
Well, you can say something, but I mean, even then, I didn't ask. But everybody feels it's like,
it's just a recommend.
That's what they feel. This is the way it is. No, it's the way you think it should be. But it doesn't mean that it's what it is. There's a difference between asking for feedback and asking for opinions, wanting to have a discussion, versus just saying, well, you know, I really like this thing. That sucked. I don't care. I didn't ask you
Thank
that.
you for your detailed opinion. I learned a lot.
Yes.
That's how you should read. I respond like that all the time. Or somebody's reading on a comment, I'll just be like, "I thank you," or thumbs up or something. But
it doesn't pay to get into it, but it is difficult sometimes. I get very annoyed. But you know, it's the same thing with anything else. Like whenever I post an announcement of something that I'm working on, is it a commentary for or something like that? Oh, are they re-releasing that again? Why do you have to feel the need to come in and say something negative? And I've gotten into that with numerous people, and it invariably ends up with people unfriending me. But it's okay, because I'm like,
at the very least, your page. Like, if you just go over to fucking Dawn of the Disc and complain, right on my page, you got to complain.
Or go to the Blue Underground page, or the Severin page, or whatever, if you want to bitch. If I'm sharing something I'm excited about, why do you feel the need? But this is the downside. This is the dark downside of social media, which is this entitlement mentality. Everybody feels this need that they have to, their opinion is the most important, and they have to get it out there, have to say it. And my thing is, just because you think something doesn't mean you necessarily have to say it. So
yeah, for sure.
Not to sound too precious about it or anything like that, but it is sort of indicative of other things we were talking about. About the way fans react, and the way that fights break out over silly things. It usually comes out of that type of negativity on some level. It's usually because somebody just decides they've got to come in and say something smart, something they think is smart. And it just escalates from there, and it's never going to change. But I'd like to think it could.
The one thing that I will bring up is, as you brought up the exact point that George Romero had in Diary of the Dead, which came out in 2006, 2007, which at the time of that movie, most of us, well, I know I didn't love it, and I don't love it, but there is some certain genius in it at times, which Romero was known for, putting something in a movie that 20 years later, you're like, he was right. He has this moment where he says, with the internet now, everybody has a voice, and those voices that are actually reasonable get drowned out by everybody. And that stuck with me because it's 100% true. You can't find a reasonable, logical voice anymore.
Yeah. Well, you're wrong about Diary of the Dead. It's a great film. No, I'm kidding. I do think it's a great film, though. I like it a lot.
I love some parts of it. There's just some of it I'm like, what the? It's weird.
There are a couple bits I could do without. There was some clumsy humor in it that I didn't care for, but overall, I thought it was a really good film. But I've been thinking about this a lot lately too, just with regards to what's been going on with this country for the past several years, and people, how divisive things are, and a lot of it comes down to the fact that we have a sort of unbroken news cycle, and we have 24 news coverage, 24-hour, 365 days a year, and it never stops. And some people just, they sit there and they glue themselves to, and essentially, I don't think it's unfair to say that probably many news outlets are probably more geared towards the left, but then you have something like Fox that's geared very much on the right, and both are problematic, although I would much rather watch the stuff on the left because that's what I think, and therefore I'm more open to that versus the other side I can't tolerate. But it would be nice if we could get back to some degree of objectivity instead of editorializing all the time and just report the facts and let people make up their own minds.
They want to sell you a product. That's
well, they want to sell you a product. They want to get clicks. They want to get likes. They want to get reacts and everything. And what it ends up happening is people glue themselves to this, and especially certain people who have serious psychological problems sit there and they glue themselves to this, and it helps warp their thinking, because then they're playing in all these sort of conspiracy theories and terrible things that
get two realities. There's two realities on this earth. You know what I mean? People think this, and it's like, well, one of these is fiction. This, you know what I mean? And
very often, in situations like that, the truth is somewhere in between, and it can, sometimes certain things are just clearly wrong, and sometimes, but ultimately I think a big part of the problem is that people are just plugged into it all the time. And now with social media, of course, that's exactly what it is. People are attached to this constantly. I know I am, more than I should be. I'm on Facebook more than I should be by far. Part of the problem for me is that I need it for promoting things, and so I would love to walk away from it, but I can't while I'm still doing things.
Yeah, I know that feeling too. I'd like to not be on it at all. I'd be much happier, but it is what it is.
I feel like it's created a lot of problems, and but the fan community and so forth, and I see a lot of this too about how wonderful fandom is and what a warm, inclusive place it is. I don't know. It hasn't really been my experience. I've seen some good aspects to it. I've seen people who are really very nice and very welcoming and very embracing, and they want to sort of pass on their knowledge and their enthusiasm and share it, and keep the ball rolling.
But there's a lot of mental illness out there.
There is a lot of it. You can see it. There's a lot of it, but there's also the kind of gatekeeping. I knew this before you did. And I see this sometimes where people say, well, why is so-and-so writing about this or talking about this? He didn't live through that period. Who gives a shit? It doesn't matter. That's not what this is. It shouldn't be based on things like that,
I agree.
But there's a lot of that. And yes, there are a lot of really sick, twisted people out there. I'm sure many people would say I'm one of them, but
I mean, I make a terrible joke sometimes, and I sometimes I don't even want to ask people to do anything on my show, because I probably said something stupid and they're going to tie it to me, and then it's going to tie to that person, and they're going to be like, and I'm going to ruin their reputation or something. But I really appreciate you coming on here, and I took a little bit more of your time than I should have, and I'm sorry about that. Did you have anything you wanted to plug?
Well, I've got coming out this year, I'm hoping by the summer, a book on Umberto Lenzi, who we were talking about, Make Them Die Slowly, the kinetic cinema of Umberto Lenzi. That'll be coming out through WK Books, first book in English on Lenzi. I'm working on another book in collaboration with an Italian friend and colleague named Eugenio Ercolani, which is going to focus on 4 directors. We're each writing about 2 of them. I've written about Massimo Dallamano already, and then I'm going to be working soon on writing about Vittorio Salerno. The idea behind this book is to focus on directors who aren't as well known, who made less films. Dallamano made 11 feature films. Salerno only made 4. So this is a much kind of smaller group of people, and Eugenio is going to be writing about Giulio Petroni and Franco Rossetti. So lesser known people. The book is tentatively to be called Unsung Heroes. So we're hoping that will be out. Well, it won't be out this year, maybe next year. And there's a variety of commentary things that'll be coming out. I can't really say anything yet, but I've done a couple of really exciting titles lately that I think people will be happy to have. Whether they'll be happy I'm on them, I don't know, but I am.
This sucks.
Yeah, well, believe me, I know. I read some of the comments sometimes, but that's okay. Everybody's entitled to their opinion. Yeah, lots of stuff coming.
I appreciate you coming on here. We had a good talk, I think, about a lot of things. And anytime you want to come on again, I know that we're probably going to do Eaten Alive if you'd still like to do it. And
yeah, we can do that.
Also, I do this silly show called The Secret Top 10, which I'm taking a little break from. I'd like you to come on to that show at one point. I can explain the rules. It's really fun and silly.
Yeah, no, that would be fun. I love lists.
Yeah, it's definitely a list show. So,
okay.